A fateful mistake. Max lived in solitude on the distant planet Exothera. As one of the few humans stationed in the alien territory, his job was simple: maintain and repair advanced tech provided by the Exotheran Council. The planet was breathtaking, with glowing trees, 2 moons, and skies that shimmered like liquid gold. But tonight, none of that beauty mattered. Max was buried in work. His outpost was a small but sturdy structure. Inside, wires snaked across the floor. A half-built drone buzzed faintly on the table, and a blinking red light signaled a potential system error. Max sighed, rubbing his temple. He had been troubleshooting all day. A single miscalculation could disrupt the entire energy grid he was responsible for. Just a quick break, Max muttered to himself. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside to stretch his legs. The air was crisp, and the twin moons bathed the alien landscape in silver light. He glanced at the glowing trees in the distance, their soft hum almost calming. Max didn't notice that he left the door to his outpost slightly ajar. Back inside, Max got back to work, completely unaware of the faint rustling noise outside. His focus was on the drone, its internal circuits refusing to cooperate. "Why won't you just work?" he muttered, pulling at the small wires with his tools. That's when he heard it, a low guttural growl that sent shivers down his spine. Max froze. His hand hovered above the drone, his heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he turned his head. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't a machine error. It was alive. "Is someone there?" Max called out, his voice cracking slightly. His outpost was supposed to be secure. No one, human or Exotheran, could enter without clearance. The shadows in the corner shifted. Something large and sleek moved. Max's breath caught in his throat. He reached for the plasma wrench on his table, his only weapon. A figure stepped into the light. She was unlike anything Max had ever seen. Her tall, slender form shimmered with iridescent scales that caught the light like gemstones. Her eyes glowed a piercing gold, and faint tendrils of mist seemed to swirl around her. She was unmistakably Exotheran, but not just any Exotheran. She had the markings of royalty. Max tightened his grip on the wrench. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" The alien woman tilted her head, her gaze locking onto his. Her voice was soft, but carried an edge of desperation. "Door, open." Max's stomach sank. He had been careless. The woman took a shaky step forward, her movements unsteady. Max noticed her claws were retracted, her posture defensive rather than threatening. She wasn't here to attack him. "I need help," she said, her words fragmented. The Exotheran language was complex, but she was making an effort to communicate in English. Max hesitated. Helping Exotheran, especially one of royal blood, could bring him trouble. Yet, as he studied her, he saw something strange in her expression. Fear. "What's going on?" he asked, lowering the wrench slightly. She exhaled shakily, her gaze darting toward the door. "Mating season. Sisters. Hunting me." "Mating season," Max repeated, confused. Then it clicked. Exotheran mating rituals were notorious, even among humans. Royal females competed for dominance, often resulting in violent clashes. It wasn't just about finding a mate, it was about survival. "You're saying your sisters are after you?" Max asked. She nodded. "If they find me, they will fight. I cannot lose." Max ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. He barely understood Exotheran politics, but he knew enough to realize this wasn't a small problem. If her sisters showed up, his outpost could become a battleground. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice firm. The woman's glowing eyes narrowed. "You left door open. Your mistake. Now, you help." Max opened his mouth to argue but stopped when a loud thud echoed from outside. Both of them froze. The sound came again, closer this time. "Is that them?" Max whispered. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she moved closer to him, her golden eyes filled with urgency. blocked door. Now. Max didn't need to be told twice. He rushed to the entrance, his hands fumbling as he slid the heavy steel lock into place. A moment later, a shadow passed by the window. A massive figure with glowing eyes similar to hers. "They're here," she whispered. Max's pulse raced. This was more than he had signed up for. His quiet, solitary life had just turned into a nightmare. As the two stood in silence, the woman spoke again, her voice low but commanding. "You help me. I protect you. Deal." Max looked at her, realizing he had no choice. The growls outside grew louder, more insistent. Whatever was coming, they would have to face it together. "Deal," he said, gripping the plasma wrench tightly. The night had just begun, and Max was already regretting leaving his door open. The unexpected guest. Max stared at the alien woman, Zilara, standing in his outpost like a storm trapped in a bottle. Her shimmering scales reflected the dim light of his workshop, and her glowing eyes locked onto his. She radiated an aura of power, but her exhaustion was equally visible. She was taller than Max, her figure elegant but coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action at the slightest threat. The silence between them stretched until Max broke it. "Okay, Zilara. Right? You're telling me your sisters are trying to kill you because of some alien mating tradition. That's insane." Zilara tilted her head, her sharp features twisting in confusion. "You do not understand. It is not tradition. It is survival. My sisters will not stop until I am defeated, or until they are." Max let out a frustrated sigh, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "Great, and you brought this situation into my home. You said it yourself. I left the door open, but this is on you now." Zilara's lips curled into what Max could only describe as an alien smirk. "You are human. Your species claims to be resourceful. Prove it." Before Max could respond, the faint sound of something scraping against the exterior of the outpost made his stomach tighten. He turned his head toward the door. The faint glow of moonlight through the cracks revealed a shadow moving outside. "They're here," Zilara whispered, her voice calm but firm. Max clenched his jaw, moving to grab his plasma wrench again. "What happens if they get in here? Your sisters don't seem like the negotiating type." Zilara stepped closer, her presence commanding yet oddly vulnerable. "They will challenge me. Fight me. If I lose, I die. If I win, they will retreat, for now." Max gave her a sideways glance. "And if I get in the way, they will kill you too," she said flatly. "But I will not let that happen." The scraping sound at the door grew louder, followed by a low guttural growl. It was the same sound Max had heard before, but this time it was much closer and angrier. The door shuddered as something slammed against it, hard enough to rattle the walls. Max cursed under his breath. "Your sisters are really committed to this, huh?" Zilara ignored him, instead stepping toward the door. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her glowing eyes narrowing as she seemed to focus on the shadow outside. She raised a clawed hand, her scales shimmering faintly, and spoke in her native language. The words were melodic but sharp, carrying a weight that made Max's skin crawl. "What are you doing?" he whispered, inching closer to her. Zilara didn't turn to him, calling her out. "If she wishes to challenge me, she will face me on my terms." Max's eyes widened. "Wait, what? You're just going to let her in here?" "It is the way," Zilara said simply. Max groaned, running a hand through his hair. "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. This isn't some arena. This is my home." Zilara finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Your home is already compromised. You left the door open, human. Now you must adapt." The door shuddered again, harder this time, and a deep crack began to form along the edge. Max felt his heart hammering in his chest. His tools and gadgets were scattered around the room, but none of them were designed for combat. He glanced at Zilara, who stood motionless, her claws slowly extending. "You've got a plan, right?" he asked, his voice rising with panic. "Please tell me you've got a plan." Zilara nodded. "I fight. You survive." "Fantastic," Max muttered sarcastically. He grabbed a metal rod from his workbench and held it like a makeshift weapon, though he doubted it would do much good. The door finally gave way, splintering as a massive figure forced its way inside. Another Scytheran female, even taller and more muscular than Zilara, stepped into the room. Her scales were a deep shade of red, and her glowing yellow eyes scanned the space before settling on Zilara. The newcomer let out a low growl, her lips curling back to reveal sharp, gleaming teeth. She spoke in the Scytheran tongue, her voice dripping with malice. Max didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The message was clear. She was here for blood. Zilara stepped forward, her posture calm but ready. She replied in the same language, her tone firm and unyielding. The tension in the room was suffocating, and Max could only watch as the two alien women squared off, their gazes locked. "Stay back," Zilara said to Max without turning her head. "This is my fight." "Yeah, no problem," Max muttered, taking a cautious step back. He felt completely out of his depth. He was just an engineer, not some action hero. Yet here he was, caught in the middle of an alien deathmatch. The red-scaled Scytheran lunged first, her movements so fast that Max barely saw them. Zilara sidestepped gracefully, her claws flashing as she countered with a strike of her own. The clash of their bodies sent a shockwave through the room, knocking over tools and equipment. Sparks flew as one of Max's drones short-circuited, adding chaos to the already intense scene. Max ducked behind his workbench, clutching the metal rod like a lifeline. He peeked out just in time to see Zilara land a devastating blow to her opponent's side, sending the larger Scytheran crashing into a wall. But the red-scaled warrior was far from finished. She roared, charging at Zilara with renewed fury. The fight was brutal and primal, a whirlwind of claws, scales, and raw power. Max could hardly keep track of who was winning. All he knew was that his outpost was rapidly turning into a war zone. Just when it seemed like Zilara was gaining the upper hand, the red-scaled Scytheran turned her attention to Max. Her glowing eyes locked onto him, and she let out a guttural snarl. "Oh," Max whispered. Before he could react, Zilara moved with blinding speed, placing herself between Max and her opponent. "You will not touch him," she growled, her voice filled with unshakable resolve. For the first time, Max felt a flicker of hope. Zilara wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for him too. The battle was far from over, but Max knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone. Survival plan. The outpost was a wreck. Sparks flew from damaged equipment. Shattered pieces of alien tech littered the floor, and the air buzzed with the aftermath of Zilara's fierce duel. Max sat slumped against the wall, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. Across the room, Zilara stood tall, her iridescent scales dimmed with exhaustion, but her golden eyes still fierce. The body of the defeated challenger lay crumpled near the door. Max averted his gaze. He had never seen such raw violence up close before. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice shaky. Zilara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "No, that was only the beginning. My sisters will sense her defeat. They will come for me, and for you." Max groaned, rubbing his face with both hands. "Fantastic. So what's the plan, oh fearless alien warrior? Because sitting here waiting to get killed isn't on my to-do list." Zilara knelt beside him, her movements deliberate and graceful. "You are human. You think differently. You see solutions where others see obstacles. We will use that." "Great pep talk," Max muttered, his sarcasm thinly veiled. "But what exactly do you expect me to do? Build a weapon out of spare parts and hope for the best?" Zilara tilted her head, her golden eyes studying him. "Yes." Max blinked. "Wait, what?" Zilara stood and gestured to the scattered tools and broken tech around the room. Your machines. They are clever. You will use them to trap my sisters, to turn their strength against them." Max looked around the wreckage of his workshop, his mind racing. Traps. He wasn't a soldier or a strategist, but he was an engineer. If there was one thing he knew how to do, it was making things work, especially under pressure. "Okay," he said, getting to his feet. "Traps. Sure, I can do traps. But let's be clear, if this goes wrong, we're both dead." Zilara gave him a small nod. "Then it will not go wrong." Max wasted no time, diving into the mess of wires, gears, and circuits. He quickly sketched out a plan in his head. The outpost had a backup power source, designed to handle surges and emergencies. If he could reroute the energy, he could create an electromagnetic field strong enough to temporarily disorient the Scytherans. It wouldn't hurt them. At least, he hoped it wouldn't, but it might give Zilara the advantage she needed. As he worked, Zilara moved to the doorway, her claws flexing as she kept watch. The defeated Scytheran's body had already dissolved into a strange, shimmering mist, a trait of her species, Max guessed. It was both unsettling and a relief. At least he wouldn't have to explain a corpse to anyone. "Tell me about your sisters," Max said as he soldered a connection. "What are we dealing with?" Zilara didn't look back. "They are strong, fierce. Each one will be more dangerous than the last. They will not underestimate me as the first did." Max winced. "That's comforting." "They are also predictable," Zilara added. "They will come one at a time, seeking to face me in combat. It is their pride. It is their weakness." Max paused, considering her words. "Pride, huh? Maybe we can use that." Hours passed as Max worked, his hands moving with frantic precision. He rigged up the electromagnetic field near the entrance, setting it to trigger when the next challenger stepped inside. For the interior, he modified one of his drones to emit a blinding flash of light, a temporary distraction to give Zilara the upper hand. It wasn't much, but it was the best he could do with limited time and resources. As he tested the final connection, Zilara approached him. Her scales shimmered faintly, a sign of her recovering strength. "You work quickly," she said. "Not quickly enough," Max replied. "Are you sure you can handle another fight? You barely got through the last one." Zilara's eyes softened just for a moment. "I have no choice. If I fail, they will kill you." Max frowned. "Why do you care what happens to me? I'm just some random human who left his door open." Zilara hesitated before answering. "You gave me shelter, even after knowing the danger. In my culture, that is not forgotten." Max snorted. "Great. Alien honor codes, just what I needed." The outpost fell silent as the two prepared for the next attack. Max double-checked the traps, his nerves fraying with each passing second. Zilara stood by the entrance, her posture relaxed but ready, like a predator waiting to strike. Then the first sound came, a low, resonating hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was followed by a distant growl, growing louder with each passing moment. "They're here," Zilara said, her voice steady. Max swallowed hard, gripping a makeshift weapon he had cobbled together, a metal rod with an electrified tip. "Let's hope this plan works." The hum grew into a roar, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Outside, shadows moved in the moonlight, their forms massive and menacing. One of Zilara's sisters stepped into view, her red-gold scales gleaming like fire. She let out a piercing roar, her voice echoing through the night. Zilara squared her shoulders, her claws flexing. "This one is stronger," she said. "Stronger than the last one." Max muttered. "Perfect." The challenger stepped toward the outpost, her glowing eyes locked on Zilara. Max's trap was armed and ready, but his heart pounded in his chest. If this didn't work, they wouldn't get a second chance. "Let her come," Zilara said, her voice low but fierce. "We will show her the strength of your machines." Max nodded, sweat dripping down his brow. Here goes nothing. As the challenger stepped into the outpost, Max activated the trap. The room lit up with a surge of energy, and the fight began. The first encounter. The moment Max activated the trap, the outpost came alive with a crackling burst of energy. Blue arcs of light danced across the walls, temporarily disorienting Zilara's sister as she stepped inside. The towering alien warrior let out a guttural roar, shaking her head violently as if trying to clear the static from her senses. "Now!" Max yelled, backing away toward the far corner of the room. Zilara didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, her movements a blur of iridescent scales and razor-sharp claws. Her sister, still dazed from the electromagnetic field, barely managed to raise her arms in time to block the first attack. Their clash was immediate and ferocious, a whirlwind of strikes that sent sparks and debris flying across the room. Max ducked behind his workbench, clutching his makeshift weapon as the two Exitherans fought. The sheer force of their battle rattled the walls, and he couldn't help but feel like a fragile insect caught in the wake of two titans. Zilara's claws raked across her sister's scaled arm, leaving a trail of glowing, silvery blood. Her opponent roared in fury, retaliating with a powerful swipe that sent Zilara skidding across the floor. She hit the wall with a grunt but recovered quickly, her golden eyes blazing with determination. Max watched in awe and terror as the two aliens moved with inhuman speed and grace. Each strike was calculated, each dodge a display of primal instinct honed over years of survival. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, but despite her skill, Zilara was struggling. Her sister was larger and stronger, her strikes hitting with the force of a sledgehammer. "This isn't going to end well," Max muttered under his breath. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on the modified drone he had prepared earlier. It was supposed to emit a blinding flash of light, but he hadn't tested it yet. As Zilara's sister landed a heavy blow that knocked her to the ground, Max made a split-second decision. "Hang on, Zilara," he shouted, reaching for the drone's remote control. The drone buzzed to life, hovering above the battlefield. Zilara's sister glanced up at it, her glowing eyes narrowing in confusion. Before she could react, Max triggered the flash. A blinding burst of white light filled the room, so intense that even Max had to shield his eyes. Zilara's sister roared in agony, stumbling backward as she clawed at her face. Zilara took advantage of the opening, leaping to her feet and launching herself at her opponent with renewed ferocity. Her claws found their mark, slashing across her sister's chest in a move so precise it left the larger alien gasping for air. Max peeked out from behind the workbench, his heart pounding as he watched Zilara pin her sister to the ground. The fight wasn't over yet, but the tide had turned. Zilara's smaller frame belied her strength as she held her opponent down, her claws poised for a final strike. "Yield," Zilara commanded, her voice ringing out like a thunderclap. Her sister growled, her glowing eyes filled with defiance. But as the seconds passed, the larger Xytheran's strength began to fade. The silvery blood from her wounds pooled on the floor, and her breaths came in labored gasps. Finally, with a low guttural snarl, she uttered a single word in the Xytheran language, a word that Max didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. She had surrendered. Zilara stepped back, releasing her hold. Her sister rose to her knees, her movements slow and deliberate. Despite her injuries, there was a strange dignity in her posture. She looked at Zilara, then at Max, before turning and limping toward the door. "She's leaving?" Max asked, his voice incredulous. "She has no choice," Zilara replied, her tone calm but firm. "She knows she cannot defeat me. Her pride will not allow her to stay." Max let out a long breath, slumping against the wall. That was insane. Zilara turned to face him, her golden eyes softening for a moment. "You helped. Without your machines, I might not have survived." Max gave a weak laugh. "Yeah, well, I didn't exactly do it for free. You owe me a new door, and maybe an entire outpost." Before Zilara could respond, a deep, resonating hum echoed from outside. Both of them froze. The sound was different this time, deeper, more menacing, Max's stomach dropped as he realized what it meant. "There's another one, isn't there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Zilara nodded, her expression grim. "Yes. And she will be stronger." Max stared at her, his exhaustion giving way to a rising sense of dread. "Stronger than that? Are you kidding me?" Zilara didn't answer. Instead, she moved to the doorway, her claws flexing as she prepared for the next challenge. Max followed her, his makeshift weapon still clutched in his hands. He had no idea how they were going to survive another attack, but one thing was clear: the night was far from over. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, each one shaking the ground like a drumbeat. Max glanced at Zilara, his voice tinged with both fear and determination. "Got any more brilliant ideas?" Zilara's lips curled into a small, fierce smile. "Yes. But this time, we fight together." Max nodded, gripping his weapon tightly. He wasn't a fighter, and he definitely wasn't a hero. But if this was the only way to survive, he wasn't about to back down. "Let's do this," he said, as the door shuddered with the force of the next arrival. A fragile alliance. The outpost was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the second challenger's departure. The only sounds were the faint hum of damaged equipment and Max's labored breathing. He slumped against the wall, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. Across the room, Zilara stood motionless, her golden eyes fixed on the door, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. "You know," Max said between breaths, "this wasn't how I imagined spending my night. Fixing drones. Sure. Hosting a gladiator match. Not so much." Zilara didn't respond. Her posture was tense, her claws flexing at her sides. She looked like a predator waiting for the next strike, every muscle in her body coiled and ready. "Zilara," Max said, forcing himself to his feet, "we need to talk. If another one of your sisters shows up, we're toast. That last one almost tore this place apart." Zilara turned to him, her expression unreadable. "There will be another. She is the strongest of us. She will not hesitate." "Great," Max muttered, rubbing his temples. "Just what I needed to hear. So what's the plan? Because we can't just keep fighting them one by one until this place collapses." Zilara hesitated, something flickering in her eyes. Was it doubt? Fear? Max couldn't tell. "You said humans are resourceful. Do you have a suggestion?" Max sighed, pacing the room as he tried to think. His mind raced, searching for anything that could give them an edge. The outpost was barely holding together, and most of his equipment was either destroyed or running on borrowed time. But there was one thing he hadn't used yet, a prototype energy amplifier he had been working on for the Scytheran Council. The amplifier was designed to boost the power of Scytheran technology, creating a temporary surge in energy output. If he could modify it to work with Zilara's unique biology, it might give her the strength to match her final opponent. But there was a catch. "It's risky," Max said finally, turning to Zilara. "I've got a device that might help you, but it's untested. If it works, it could make you stronger, just for a short time. But if it fails..." Zilara stepped closer, her glowing eyes narrowing. "What happens if it fails?" Max hesitated. "It could hurt you. A lot. Maybe even kill you." For a moment, Zilara said nothing. Then, to Max's surprise, she smiled, a small, sharp smile that sent a chill down his spine. "I would rather risk death than defeat. Show me this device." Max led her to a reinforced storage cabinet in the corner of the room. Inside was the energy amplifier, a sleek, palm-sized device with glowing blue lines running along its surface. He pulled it out carefully, holding it up for Zilara to see. "This thing is supposed to sync with Scytheran energy patterns," he explained. "If I can adjust the frequency to match your physiology, it should boost your strength and speed. But it's tricky. I'll need your help to calibrate it." Zilara nodded, extending her arm toward him. Her scales shimmered faintly, and Max could feel a subtle warmth radiating from her. Do what you must." Max got to work, connecting the amplifier to his portable terminal and scanning Zilara's energy signature. The process was slow and delicate, each adjustment requiring intense focus. Zilara stood perfectly still, her gaze never leaving Max's hands as he worked. "You're awfully calm for someone who might explode in the next 5 minutes," Max said, trying to lighten the mood. Zilara tilted her head. "Fear is a waste of time. It does not serve me." "Well, I'm terrified enough for both of us," Max muttered. "So, there's that." As Max continued to tweak the amplifier, a sudden low hum filled the room. It wasn't coming from his equipment. It was coming from outside. "They're here," Zilara said, her voice low and steady. Max glanced at her, his heart sinking. "Already? I'm not done yet." Zilara placed a clawed hand on his shoulder, stopping him. "There is no more time. I will face her with or without your device." Max shook his head. "You don't stand a chance without this. Just give me a few more minutes." The hum grew louder, shaking the walls of the outpost. Max's fingers moved faster, his mind racing as he worked to finalize the calibration. Come on," he muttered under his breath. Finally, the device let out a soft chime. Max pulled it free from the terminal and turned to Zilara. "Okay, it's ready. Just press this panel to activate it. But remember, it's only temporary. Don't push yourself too hard." Zilara took the amplifier from him, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Max." Before he could respond, the door to the outpost exploded inward, sending debris flying across the room. Max barely had time to duck as a massive figure stepped through the smoke and dust. This Scytheran was unlike the others. She was taller, her scales gleaming with a dark, metallic sheen that seemed to absorb the light. Her golden eyes burned with an intensity that made Max's blood run cold. This wasn't just another challenger. This was a predator. Zilara stepped forward, activating the amplifier as she moved. The device glowed brightly, and for a moment, her entire body was bathed in a shimmering blue aura. She straightened, her posture radiating strength and confidence. The final challenger let out a deep, rumbling growl, her gaze locking onto Zilara. "You should have run," she said in the Tytheran tongue, her voice low and menacing. "I do not run," Zilara replied, her claws extending. "Come, let us end this." Max watched from the corner of the room, his heart pounding as the two Scytherans squared off. He gripped his makeshift weapon tightly, knowing that this fight would decide everything. If Zilara failed, there would be no escape, not for her, and not for him. The final battle had begun. The final stand. The outpost was no longer just a home. It was a battlefield. Sparks crackled from shattered equipment. The metallic walls groaned under the strain of the ongoing chaos, and the air was thick with tension. Zilara stood at the center, her body radiating a pulsing blue light from the amplifier Max had calibrated. She looked stronger, fiercer, almost otherworldly, as if she had become the embodiment of power itself. Across from her, the final challenger loomed. She was taller, broader, and more menacing than either of the sisters that had come before. Her metallic black scales gleamed like polished obsidian, and her golden eyes burned with hatred. There was no hesitation, no fear, only the unrelenting drive to dominate. Max crouched behind an overturned table, clutching his makeshift weapon. His pulse raced as he glanced between the two Scytherans. He felt completely out of place in this moment, like a bystander in a war he barely understood. But he knew one thing. If Zilara lost, they were both dead. The challenger moved first. With a roar that shook the outpost, she launched herself at Zilara with incredible speed. Zilara barely sidestepped the attack, her amplified reflexes allowing her to dodge at the last second. The challenger's claws struck the wall, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Zilara countered immediately, her claws glowing faintly as she swiped at her opponent's side. The strike connected, leaving a trail of shimmering black blood. But the challenger barely flinched. She spun around, her tail whipping through the air with devastating force. It hit Zilara square in the chest, sending her flying backward into a pile of debris. "Zilara!" Max shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. Zilara groaned as she pushed herself to her feet. The blue aura around her flickered slightly, but her golden eyes burned with determination. She didn't respond to Max. Her focus was entirely on the towering figure before her. "You cannot win," the challenger growled, her voice deep and resonant. "You are weak, a pretender." Zilara's lips curled into a defiant snarl. "We will see." The fight intensified. The two Ixitharans moved like blurs, their strikes landing with enough force to shake the ground. Zilara's amplified abilities allowed her to keep up, but it was clear that the challenger's raw power was overwhelming. Every blow she landed seemed to take a little more out of Zilara, the blue light around her growing dimmer with each passing moment. Max couldn't just sit and watch anymore. He scanned the room, his eyes darting between the scattered tools and broken devices. There had to be something he could do, some way to tip the odds in Zilara's favor. Then he saw it, the power core. It was a small portable generator he had been using to test his drones. If he could overload it, it might create a shockwave strong enough to stun the challenger without harming Zilara. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. As Zilara and her opponent clashed again, Max crawled toward the power core, keeping low to avoid drawing attention. His hands trembled as he worked quickly, bypassing the safety protocols and rerouting the power flow. The core began to hum, its energy levels rising dangerously. Zilara, meanwhile, was struggling. The challenger had managed to pin her against the wall, one massive claw pressing against her throat. The blue light around Zilara flickered weakly, her strength rapidly draining. "You are nothing," the challenger snarled, her voice dripping with disdain. "A failure, unworthy of the crown." Zilara's gaze shifted slightly, locking onto Max. Despite the pain, a faint smile tugged at her lips. She knew what he was doing. "Zilara, duck!" Max shouted as he triggered the overloaded power core. The device emitted a blinding flash of light, followed by a shockwave that rippled through the room. The challenger roared in pain, releasing Zilara and stumbling backward as the wave of energy disoriented her. Sparks flew, and the metallic walls of the outpost groaned under the strain, but the plan had worked. Zilara fell to the ground, gasping for air. The blue aura around her flared brightly one last time before fading completely. She was exhausted, but she wasn't done yet. With a roar of her own, Zilara pushed herself to her feet. She moved with a speed and precision that took even Max by surprise, closing the distance between her and the stunned challenger in an instant. Her claws struck true, slashing across her opponent's chest in a series of devastating blows. The challenger staggered, her golden eyes wide with shock. She tried to retaliate, but Zilara was relentless, her strikes coming faster and harder with each passing second. Finally, with a final powerful blow, Zilara knocked the challenger to the ground. The room fell silent. The challenger lay motionless, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. Zilara stood over her, her posture proud and unyielding. "Yield," Zilara commanded, her voice cold and authoritative. The challenger hesitated, her eyes flicking between Zilara and Max. Then, with a low, rumbling growl, she lowered her head in submission. Zilara stepped back, her body swaying slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. She turned to Max, who was still crouched behind the table, his face a mix of relief and disbelief. "You did it," Max said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We did it," Zilara corrected, a faint smile on her lips. But as the two shared a brief moment of victory, a faint sound echoed from outside, a distant roar, growing louder by the second. Max's stomach dropped. "Zilara," he said, his voice trembling. "Please tell me that's not another one." Zilara's expression darkened. "It is not." Max frowned. "Then what?" Before he could finish, the ground shook violently, and the walls of the outpost groaned. Whatever was coming, it was bigger than anything they had faced before. A new bond. The rumbling grew louder, the ground trembling beneath their feet as Max and Zilara exchanged a tense glance. Max's heart pounded, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios. What could be worse than the challengers they had already faced? "This isn't one of your sisters, is it?" Max asked, his voice tinged with panic. "No," Zilara replied, her tone grim. "This is something else." The door to the outpost, already hanging on its hinges, shuddered violently before being ripped off completely. Max stumbled backward as an enormous figure loomed in the doorway, its silhouette blocking out the faint moonlight. It wasn't Tytherin. It was something entirely different. The creature stepped inside, its towering form covered in jagged, black armor-like plating. Its glowing red eyes swept the room, locking onto Zilara with predatory intent. A low, mechanical growl emanated from its chest, sending a chill down Max's spine. "What is that thing?" Max whispered. "A Scytheran enforcer," Zilara said, her voice low but steady. "It is here to enforce the Council's laws, and to eliminate me." Max's stomach twisted. "Eliminate you? For what?" "For dishonoring the royal family," Zilara said, her claws flexing as she prepared for another fight. "By surviving, I have disrupted the balance of power. The enforcer has been sent to restore order." "Restore order?" Max snapped. "That's insane. You've done nothing wrong." Zilara glanced at him, her expression softening slightly. "To them, my survival is a threat. But this is not your fight, Max. You should leave." Max stared at her, his grip tightening on his makeshift weapon. "You think I'm going to just walk out and leave you to face that thing alone? Not a chance." Zilara's lips twitched into a faint smile, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned her attention back to the enforcer, who had begun advancing toward them. The ground shook with each step, and its mechanical growls grew louder. "Stay behind me," Zilara said, stepping forward to meet the threat. The enforcer lunged with shocking speed for something so large, its massive claws slicing through the air. Zilara dodged to the side, her movements still graceful despite her exhaustion. She countered with a powerful swipe of her own, her claws raking across the enforcer's armored chest. Sparks flew, but the creature barely flinched. Max watched helplessly as the two clashed, their battle far more intense than anything he'd seen before. Zilara was quick, her strikes precise, but the enforcer's sheer size and strength gave it the upper hand. Each blow it landed sent Zilara stumbling, and its armor seemed impervious to her attacks. "This isn't working," Max muttered, his mind racing. He scanned the room, searching for anything that could give them an edge. His eyes landed on the remains of the energy amplifier, now lying discarded on the floor. An idea began to form, a dangerous, desperate idea. "Zilara," Max shouted, grabbing the amplifier and rushing toward her. "I've got a plan, but it's risky." Zilara glanced at him, her golden eyes narrowing. "What is it?" "I'm going to overload the amplifier," Max said, holding up the device. "If we can get the enforcer close enough, the explosion might be enough to take it down." Zilara hesitated, her gaze flicking between Max and the towering enforcer. "And what about you?" "I'll manage," Max said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. "Just trust me." Zilara gave a small nod. "Do it." Max worked quickly, his fingers moving with practiced precision as he bypassed the amplifier's safety protocols. The device began to glow brightly, its hum growing louder with each passing second. Meanwhile, Zilara continued to engage the enforcer, her movements calculated as she tried to draw it closer to the center of the room. The enforcer let out a guttural roar, its claws slamming into the ground as it lunged at Zilara. She dodged gracefully, positioning herself near Max and the now glowing amplifier. "Now, Max," Zilara shouted. Max didn't hesitate. He activated the amplifier and hurled it toward the enforcer. The device landed at the creature's feet, its glow intensifying as it reached critical mass. "Get down," Max yelled, grabbing Zilara and pulling her behind the workbench. The explosion was deafening, a blinding flash of light engulfing the room. The shockwave sent debris flying, and Max felt the heat wash over him as he shielded Zilara with his body. When the light finally faded, he peeked over the edge of the workbench, his ears ringing. The enforcer lay in a crumpled heap at the center of the room, its armor cracked and smoldering. Sparks flickered from its shattered form, and its red eyes dimmed before going dark. "We did it," Max said, his voice shaky. Zilara pushed herself to her feet, her movements slow but steady. She approached the fallen enforcer, her gaze hard. After a moment, she turned back to Max, a small smile on her lips. "You were reckless," she said, "but effective." Max let out a weak laugh. "I'll take that as a compliment." The two stood in the wreckage of the outpost, the adrenaline slowly fading. Max looked at Zilara, his expression serious. "What happens now?" Zilara's smile faded, replaced by a look of determination. "The Council will send more enforcers. They will not stop until they are satisfied." Max frowned. "So what do we do?" Zilara met his gaze, her golden eyes filled with resolve. "We leave. Together." Max blinked. "Leave? Where?" "Anywhere," Zilara said. "Your world, perhaps. I cannot stay here, but I will not forget what you have done for me." Max hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Let's get out of here." As the two prepared to leave the outpost, Max couldn't help but feel a strange sense of hope. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wasn't facing it alone.